listener production.
Hi, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Australia's e-Safety Commissioner recently admitted that the proliferation of online child sexual abuse material is getting worse by the day. It's a horrific thing to think about, but there is a lot of work going into stopping it that most of us have no idea about.
Look, it really is a village issue. Every sector that has any kind of an ownership in this needs to take responsibility, and that goes down to parents, carers and guardians as well.
We dive deeper into the work being done by detectives across Australia in the second half of this episode. First, though, it's time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It is Monday, September 23rd.
Good morning, Sash. As we start a new working week, there's news that we are currently living through the longest period of economic misery in Australia in more than a decade. So inflation and high interest rates have combined to stifle the working class since the pandemic, and that's according to the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Australia's misery index is currently almost double the rate it was pre-COVID, but it is lower than peaks during the height of inflation in 2023 and also the global financial crisis in 2008.
Yeah, however, with unemployment now starting to creep up and the economy slowing down, there has been a further uptick in misery since the middle of this year. So all of this is to say, if you're feeling a little bit down about the state of your and the country's finances, you're definitely not alone. But there is some positive financial news today. Now, it's all very GDP, gross price, decimal index, whatever. But it's good, so I'm going to tell you what it is. The Albanese government is today going to reveal that Australia's gross debt for 2023-24 is $149 billion lower than what was forecast at the time of the last federal election before Labor took office. So Australia's gross debt compared to Australia's GDP is now 10.6% lower than what Labor inherited from a coalition government. So that's good. We've reduced our debt position by about $17 billion, and that means it's going to save us about $80 billion in interest. So, yay!
Changing pace now and over to the Middle East, where Israel and Hezbollah have continued to exchange heavy fire across the border. The Lebanese militant group has sent rockets deep into northern Israel after facing some of its most intense bombardment in almost a year of fighting. Israel has reported no fatalities on its end, despite around 150 rockets, cruise missiles and drones being fired, most of which were intercepted by air defences. While over the weekend, Israeli airstrikes on Beirut killed 45 people, with Hezbollah claiming 16 of its members, including senior leaders and commanders, were among the dead. The IDF says it struck around 290 targets on Saturday, including thousands of Hezbollah rocket launcher barrels.
Yeah, Netanyahu has said that Israel will take whatever action is necessary. He says that's to restore peace and to bring our people safe back to their homes, end quote. In a separate video statement, he also said, and this is another quote, if Hezbollah has not understood the message, I promise you it will understand the message, end quote. Now, Hezbollah has vowed to keep fighting until there's a ceasefire in Gaza. We haven't talked about that for a while because those talks were happening really intensely about a month to a month and a half ago. They stalled and they haven't picked back up. So this conflict in the Middle East, seeing Israel now switch to the north and to Lebanon, it's a development and it's a new step in this conflict. Heading to the US now, where you guessed it, we're talking about the election. In a little more than a month, Americans will head to the polls to vote for either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump to become president. And if you were wondering whether Trump would run again in 2028 if he lost this election, we have an answer for you.
If you're not successful this time, do you see yourself running again in 4 years?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I think that will be it. I don't see that at all.
So that was the former president speaking on a program called Full Measure. Meantime, Kamala Harris has accepted an invitation from CNN to debate Trump on October 23rd, but he says it's too late because Americans would have already started voting in pre-polls by then. We will, however, get a showdown between Republican running mate JD Vance and the Democrats' pick Tim Walz on October 1, and I think that will get quite a bit of interest.
Speaking of interest, Sash, I've taken a keen interest in Trump's latest marketing efforts. So he's actually popped some commemorative coins on the market. He's selling them for about 150 Australian dollars a pop, and that's come amid flailing donations and mounting legal fees. He's also put up some Trump-branded Bibles, some Trump-branded NFTs, sneakers and playing cards.
Yeah, well, man's got to do what he's got to do to get money.
No one told you
And a big happy birthday to the iconic sitcom Friends, which has turned 30. It was on this day back in 1994 that the first episode, titled The Pilot, aired on screens across the US, and it means the show is now older than its characters, Sash.
Sad face.
It's worth noting the show didn't make it to screens down under until 2 years later, so in 1996, and in those days there was no streaming services or VPNs to watch overseas content and shows like this, Sash.
Crazy. You weren't even alive, were you?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, bless you. Interestingly, I was looking up some stuff. So there are a few other names that were thrown around for Friends. It could have been called Insomnia Cafe, which I think is a terrible name.
Horrible.
6 of 1.
Don't like it. Sounds like a Survivor show.
Or Friends Like Us, which I think is cute, but I think shortening it to Friends is iconic, and I think is part of the charm of the show. It's just about friends. It's just about mates. It went for 10 seasons, 236 episodes, and has apparently been watched more than 100 billion times across a range of platforms. I looked up the streaming minutes from the last couple of years. Every year it's streamed for billions of minutes at a time. It's still so popular. And of course, last year we saw interest peak again in the show, and we're coming up to a year since the death of Matthew Perry, and there were streaming upticks in Friends following his death because people wanted to pay tribute and remember. But yeah, 30 years old, absolutely insane to think. Chris, thank you so much for joining us for the headlines today. Next up, we are changing pace. We're going to be talking about a pretty serious issue, so trigger warning. We'll be discussing child sexual abuse material in our deep dive, but it's a really important and interesting chat about what we're doing to tackle it. A heads up before we get started today. In this deep dive, we will be discussing child sexual abuse. If that's not a topic you feel like listening to at the moment, fair enough. Maybe give this one a miss, and we'll catch you in the next episode. The Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation recently released some concerning statistics. In the last financial year, reports of online child exploitation increased by 45%, averaging about 160 a day. There are a lot of ways police will hunt down offenders of these crimes, through tip-offs, by going undercover on the dark web, and even via compulsory reporting by social media platforms. And in the murky world of online child exploitation, the question is, are these social media companies doing enough? And how else are detectives fighting the scourge? I'm joined now by retired Detective Inspector Jon Rouse. He was in Queensland's police force for 34 years and headed up Task Force Argos, implementing Australia's first operation proactively targeting internet child sex offenders. Jon, thanks so much for joining us today. You've been on the front line of these investigations into such horrific crimes. Can you give us an inside look at how police go about solving these cases?
Okay, well, if it's specifically to the online or the technology-facilitated crimes against children, there's a range of ways that information comes in. Sometimes it's from members of the public who report it directly to police or through Crime Stoppers, for example. But overarchingly, the predominance of reports that come into Australia come in as what we call cyber tips. Cyber tips come from an organisation called NECMEC, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. They're based in Washington, DC. They send these tips out globally to every country in the world. And 99% of those cyber tips are reported by industry. So, for example, Meta, Facebook, they are scanning for the distribution of child sexual abuse material across particularly their platform, Facebook Messenger. That content is automatically detected, which generates a referral to NECMEC, and then it gets packaged up as a cyber tip. It goes into the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, where there's a triage team. That team is responsible for reviewing and providing an intelligence input onto the report. It's risk assessed. It's determined whether or not it's actionable, which is the key thing to remember in this conversation. It has to be deemed as an actionable investigation for law enforcement. That evidence is then sent out to whichever jurisdiction in Australia that the offender has been detected in, whether it's Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, wherever. And locally, whether it's a jacket team, which is the joint agency child exploitation teams, which comprise both the state and federal AFP team, or in some instances it's just standalone, like, for example, in New South Wales, there's not a jacket team in existence. It goes to the team there, they then review it, and if there's sufficient evidence in their opinion, they take out a search warrant, and then the next step is to go and visit the person's address search, seize, interview, and if evidence exists, then they're arrested.
Yeah, so it sounds like quite a long, lengthy sort of process. I'm curious to know, I mean, you were part of Task Force Argos, which was a massive, hard-working investigation that was, trawling through this material online. What you mentioned there about companies like Meta being kind of at the forefront in a lot of ways in reporting this material being shared, I'm wondering, is that getting harder to do given that things like the dark web exist and encrypted end-to-end messaging exists? Like, is it getting harder and harder to track these offenders?
There's such a broad number of ways that law enforcement get engaged in this. So at Argos, there's a very intense proactive capability. So we're not waiting for information to come in. We are out there in an undercover capacity in forums like Tor on the darknet, infiltrating networks, detecting content. Largely, that's the process we're looking at there is applying our victim identification experts to look at freshly produced content to try to find the children. Endgame, the entire mission here is to stop children being sexually abused. So the proactive response is a critical component of the law enforcement arsenal because that's where the newest material is being generated by offenders and we have a chance to intervene rapidly. Also, our coverts go online pretending to be kids in chat rooms and detect offenders with online grooming, setting up meetings, things like that. Then there's the other capabilities we have, which is proactively targeting peer-to-peer networks where offenders are sharing child sexual abuse material across networks where we can detect them. So there's a number of ways that we proactively target, and then there's the reactive. So, you'd be aware of live streaming into the Philippines where there's content being produced on demand for Australian offenders that are paying for it. And there's a big response that's applied to that. And then there's the cyber tips that come in. So there's all of this spectrum of the way that police are engaged in this particular online world. Now, is it getting harder? Well, at the moment, the figures indicate that, there's a steady increase in cyber tips coming into the country, which is, on one hand, it's a good thing because that means that industry, the companies that are involved in this are reporting. They're actually detecting content and they're reporting it. You'd be aware from, if you've looked at any of the investigations we did at Argos with Tor and the darknet, that's a really challenging area for law enforcement to investigate because it's such an anonymised platform. Anything that has got encryption or anything that masks an IP, which is the user's internet address, makes it very challenging for law enforcement, but it doesn't mean we haven't been successful. So where there's a will, there is a way. I don't think it's getting harder at the moment, but moves like what Mark Zuckerberg has stated he's going to do and has commenced already, implementing end-to-end encryption on Facebook, on Messenger, is going to result in, we anticipate, somewhere around a 70% reduction in those cyber tips. So those horrendous numbers that you're hearing that are coming in to Australia, we predict. And I'm talking actionable again here, okay? I'm not talking about a lot of the noise that comes in these numbers. I'm talking about actual investigative leads that lead to a potential arrest. We anticipate that you'll see about a 70% reduction in that.
So I'm guessing that would have police and detectives who are working on these cases, this would have them quite concerned then.
We've been concerned about this for 3 or 4 years now, since Zuckerberg first started talking about it. This comes back to the whole discussion around what responsibility do these tech providers have about the safe use and the way that their platforms are used. You've seen recently that the CEO of Telegram was arrested in France because he wasn't doing anything to comply with the way that his platform was being used. We cannot give offenders, and not just child sex offenders, but we can't give these people free range to communicate and to commit criminal offences. And the tech companies cannot stick their heads in the sand on this and say, well, oh, gee, we didn't know. Because when they implement E2E, like I said on Facebook, end-to-end encryption, that's sticking your head in the sand under the guise of saying it's for users' privacy, which is absolute rubbish. What's been provided to industry by law enforcement is a set of fingerprints. Those fingerprints are hexadecimal strings. They're a string of information that we can tell the tech company that this string is child sexual abuse material. It's called photo DNA, pDNA. It runs in the background across all of these tech companies that are willing to participate in this program. It runs across the background, and all it's looking for is an exact match on a fingerprint. Right, so it doesn't care about your cooking photo or the picture of your dog or anything else that you're sharing on Messenger. It cares about whether you have sent what is known and verified by law enforcement to be child sexual abuse material. If it does, it automatically sets off a flag and it goes to be a cyber tip. That's as far as your privacy is intruded by this technology. I'd probably argue that unless you're a child sex offender, you really don't care too much about that running in the background looking to take these people out. But Zuckerberg seems to think that you do. He seems to think that that's really important. So under the guise of privacy, which is in fact my suggestion would be it's going to save them a lot of money because they can sack a lot of trust and safety officers, which they've already done, who monitor this content and report it. And also, bottom dollar, it affects his advertising and marketing of Meta because it's very heavily used by child sex offenders. Implement end-to-end encryption. That data stream can no longer be detected or examined by photo DNA. Problem goes away like magic. And that's the moral responsibility of people like Zuckerberg.
So that's what I was going to ask, is that at this point in time, the pressure is mounting on social media companies to do more to protect children. We've heard recently that the federal government wants to bring in a minimum age requirement for children in Australia to be able to access social media, which might go part of the way to kind of keep more kids off socials. And, you know, the question of whether companies like Meta are going to engage in setting up age verification and things like that is a whole other question. But I guess what my question to you is, we're in an age where the onus should be on the social media companies, but you're saying that they're actually doing less than they ever have before when it comes to trying to protect kids on socials and to shut down these predators.
Well, they're moving towards doing less. Exactly. And look, on the age verification thing, I think it's wonderful that the federal government's standing up and saying they're going to do this. But hey, they've parked the whole issue that the e-safety commissioner put forward about facial recognition and stopping children accessing pornography. They can't even do that. How are they going to keep our kids off social media when they can't even agree on moving forward to utilise technology to stop kids from accessing Pornhub? So it's a lot of good talk leading up into an election. But let's actually get some traction here and use technology that exists and try to protect our kids.
What do you think then needs to happen in this space that isn't happening from a government perspective, from a policing perspective, from even a community and parenting perspective? Like, where are we falling so short? Obviously, the responsibility is on the predators, but where can we do better that we're not yet?
Look, it really is a village issue. Every sector that has any kind of an ownership in this needs to take responsibility, and that goes down to parents, carers and guardians as well. At the outset, they're the people that are providing the technology to children. So there's an ownership responsibility there about educating yourself about the kind of technologies they're using, Snapchat and Kik, Instagram, TikTok, any of those things. You need to understand how those platforms work and how they can be exploited by child sex offenders. So that's mum and dads. Overarchingly, the legislation to support law enforcement investigations in the country is very good. In fact, it's probably and arguably some of the best in the world legislation exists. We have law enforcement capability in this country that is far greater than many countries in the world. There could be a lot more put in by increasing the response capability and the investigative capabilities in this country, for sure. But at the moment, we're doing well and boxing way above our weight in terms of our capacity to investigate. Largely, where the argument really needs to come back to is industry. Now, Julie Inman is doing her best to hold them accountable, but, you know, these companies have got very well-paid lawyers that can tie us up in litigation for the next 20, 30 years. But let's look at Apple. On that list of, 40,000 odd referrals that come into this country as cyber tips, I'd probably tell you that there may be one or two referrals from Apple. The biggest in the world, the biggest organisation in the world, providing the most number of handsets in the world, do not self-manage or self-report or self-scan for child sexual abuse material. And they keep ducking under the radar while we do attack people like Mark Zuckerberg. I think that there needs to be a very big global push back to these tech companies that have really had free range. It's been the wild, wild web for too long. Our children are suffering horrendously as a result of it from a range of things, not just online grooming and sexual abuse. Look at all the disorders that children are developing as a result of their addiction to platforms like TikTok that have algorithms specifically designed to keep you on the device. Whatever you're searching for, it'll keep that in your feed. So I think there needs to be more support for the e-safety commissioner, more support across, particularly let's get the Five Eyes engaged on this and start holding these tech companies to account and get them regulated.
Such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for sharing, a little, like I said at the start, a peek behind the curtain. It's something that we want to happen. We want these predators and child sexual abuse material to not be anywhere and to be shut down. But yeah, you've given us an idea of how you guys look to fight that, but also, where the tech companies are falling short. A really interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thanks for your time.
That was retired Detective Inspector Jon Rouse, formerly of the Queensland Police Force, speaking with me there. And that is all for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you for listening. A reminder, we put out full eps of our weekend briefing chats on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom to see them, and don't forget to subscribe. You can also catch up with our other video content on TikTok at Listener Newsroom. We're also on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.